The Appalachian Mountains, with their deep valleys and thick forests, cradle stories as ancient as the rocks that uphold their steep inclines. It is within this secluded environment that our narrative commences in McDowell County, West Virginia, circa 1923, where successive generations of families remained cut off from the broader world for many years. The Hollister clan resided in a modest log cabin positioned at the terminus of a roadway that turned untraversable during severe winters. The cabin sat so remotely that for 4 or 5 months annually, the Hollisters encountered nobody except each other. This seclusion would establish the ideal backdrop for a tragedy destined to span multiple generations. Jeremiah Hollister served as the family head, a gaunt, lengthy individual featuring a thick beard and piercing azure eyes. Left a widower at 42, he single-handedly raised his daughter Martha, a girl possessing refined characteristics. Martha's mother Sarah had passed away during a difficult childbirth when the girl was merely 6 years old. The infant, a son, likewise perished. From that point forward, father and daughter inhabited that small cabin in isolation. The nearest neighbors resided nearly 10 kilometers distant, and visits occurred infrequently. The pastor from the modest church attempted to call upon them once yearly, typically during summer. He observed that Martha, now 14, appeared progressively more introverted, avoiding direct gaze with individuals and maintaining her arms folded across her torso. Jeremiah was consistently an odd individual, relates Elenina Davis, now 93, one of the handful still living who were acquainted with the Hollisters. Even preceding Sarah's demise, he seldom descended to town. It was Sarah who came for provisions, constantly rushing, perpetually glancing behind as if she dreaded somebody might trail her. Local inhabitants commented on the peculiar dynamic between father and daughter during the uncommon instances when they materialized together at the village provision store. Martha resembled a specter, always trailing her father, answering solely with single syllables when anybody attempted to initiate conversation. The winter of 1937 proved especially brutal in the Highlands. It was during this winter that Martha, then 20 years old, found herself expecting her initial offspring. When spring eventually arrived, Martha didn't accompany her father down to town. Speculation started circulating when Jeremiah was observed purchasing infant garments at the provision store. "My daughter is anticipating," was his sole remark, his countenance as unyielding as the mountain boulders. Suspicions intensified among neighboring residents. Martha hadn't been observed with any suitor, and nobody had ventured up the mountain to woo her. The community started murmuring progressively sinister theories. It was Dr. William Foster, the sole physician in the vicinity, who was ultimately summoned to the Hollister cabin on a rainy evening in June 1938. Martha was experiencing labor and difficulties had compelled Jeremiah to seek assistance. What Dr. Foster encountered within that cabin would pursue him throughout his remaining years. Martha, pallid and delicate, delivering a baby girl with facial characteristics that instantly warned the seasoned physician about potential consanguinity. The infant arrived with numerous features typical of offspring born from intimate blood relations, cardiac abnormalities, additional digits, and a conspicuously underdeveloped jaw. She endured merely 3 days. Martha never disclosed the child's father. Yet the physician's suspicions were documented in his journal, alongside the troubling observation that Jeremiah appeared more devastated by the infant's demise than would be anticipated from a grandfather. "He clutched her as if she were his own daughter," inscribed the doctor. "He wept in a manner that compelled me to look away, as though I were witnessing something excessively intimate, too sacred in its perversity." Within those isolated highlands, where legal authority seldom extended, It wasn't unusual for families to intermarry amongst themselves. Cousins wedded cousins, uncles married nieces in attempts to preserve lands within the lineage. Yet even within this framework, specific boundaries were honored. The connection between parent and child was a taboo few communities tolerated. Check your subscription status for this channel. Ensure you don't overlook any startling narratives like this one that exposes the concealed truths within American households. Subscribe immediately to delve into humanity's most shadowy mysteries. Following the passing of Martha's initial daughter, a hush settled upon the Hollister dwelling. For nearly a year, nobody in town glimpsed Martha. Jeremiah descended alone to acquire provisions, evading any efforts at conversation. In April 1939, Martha was expecting for the second occasion. The infant, a son called Elijah, was delivered at home with assistance from a local midwife, Ida Mae Jenkins, who was summoned only at the final moment. That dwelling possessed a peculiar aroma, Ida Mae recounted years afterward. There existed something that reminded me of an injured creature, an atmosphere of hopelessness and surrender. And when I observed the infant, I comprehended why. The boy arrived with multiple visible abnormalities. His digits were fused, forming a type of claw, and his eyes exhibited different colors, one azure like Jeremiah's, the other brown like Martha's. More alarming was the abnormally enlarged size of his cranium, an indicator of hydrocephalus. That boy won't endure the winter, Ida Mae informed Jeremiah, who received the tidings with a nod. Unexpectedly, Elijah survived not merely the winter, but the subsequent 5 years. He never acquired speech beyond a few disjointed words, and his movements were constrained. Martha transported him everywhere, even when he became excessively large for it. Throughout these years, Martha conceived 2 additional times. The third offspring, a daughter named Ruth, arrived with less apparent abnormalities, yet her cognitive development was clearly impaired. The fourth child, another son, was stillborn in 1944 and was interred in the small family burial ground behind the dwelling. That household consistently experienced issues with infants who were stillborn or died prematurely, explains Harlan Thompson, a regional historian. Documentation indicates that the Hollisters arrived in the mountains during the 1820s and since then have wedded almost exclusively among cousins. This pattern of consanguineous unions generated a concentration of problematic hereditary elements that manifested in progressively severe ways. In 1945, misfortune struck the family once more when Elijah, then 6 years old, succumbed to pneumonia during an especially brutal winter. Martha was observed at the burial service clasping Ruth's hand, who was now 4 years old. Neighbors observed that Martha seemed to be expecting once more. Martha's 5th child arrived in June 1946, a daughter who was named Sarah in tribute to Martha's departed mother. Unlike her elder siblings, Sarah seemed comparatively healthy. Her eyes were a profound azure, almost indistinguishable from Jeremiah's, and her early progress seemed typical. Sarah's evident normality ushered in an alteration in Jeremiah's conduct. He started bringing her along when he visited town, displaying her with a pride that local inhabitants found unsettling. He treated her as if she were his own daughter, not his granddaughter. Recollects Clementine Parker, who worked at the provision store during that period. He kept demonstrating how intelligent she was, how rapidly she acquired knowledge, and the likeness between them was unquestionable. Same eyes, same facial structure. As Sarah matured, it became obvious that she had avoided the most severe hereditary repercussions that plagued her siblings. At 5, she irregularly attended the local educational institution during the warmer months. The instructor, Miss Abigail Wilson, observed that despite certain learning challenges, Sarah was considerably more developed than her sister Ruth. It was through Sarah that the external world started to perceive the authentic character of existence in the Hollister dwelling. On a rainy autumn day in 1952, Sarah appeared at school with a noticeable discoloration on her face. When questioned by Miss Wilson, the girl ultimately spoke. Daddy became angry because Mommy didn't want to sleep in his bed anymore. She expressed with the unsettling innocence of a youngster. He states Mommy is his, that she always has been since Grandma died. Miss Wilson reported the occurrence to the local sheriff, John Buchanan, yet lacking concrete proof beyond a child's testimony. He was disinclined to intervene. Those mountain families possess their own traditions, stated the sheriff. It's not our responsibility to meddle unless there's a distinct and immediate threat. The winter of 1952 to 1953 further separated the Hollister dwelling. When spring arrived, Martha was observed in town with Ruth and Sarah, yet she appeared worn and more aged than her 36 years indicated. Most alarming was Jeremiah's absence. It was only in July 1953, when a hunter became lost in the mountains and passed near the Hollister property, that the reality emerged. The hunter, Joseph Miller, reported observing a recent grave in the small family burial ground. The crude headstone bore Jeremiah Hollister's name carved upon it and the date of his passing, January 12, 1953. I thought it peculiar that nobody in town knew he had passed, Miller informed the sheriff. But the most peculiar thing was what I observed through the dwelling window. Martha was seated at the table with the two girls, and she seemed content. It was as though a burden had been lifted from her. The summer of 1953 brought transformations to the Hollister household. With Jeremiah's demise, Martha seemed to have discovered renewed liberation. She started frequenting the town more regularly, established a modest vegetable patch, and permitted Sarah to attend school consistently. Ruth, though still restricted in her progress, exhibited indications of enhancement in her conduct. It was during this era that Martha encountered Jacob Wheeler, a middle-aged widower who had recently relocated to the area. Jacob was a woodworker who sought refuge in the mountains following his spouse's death. Unlike most local inhabitants, he paid no attention to rumors concerning the Hollisters. Everyone carries a history, he would remark. What matters is the current moment and how we decide to live from this point forward. The friendship between Martha and Jacob developed gradually, founded on chance meetings at the provisions store and brief conversations after Sunday religious observances. For a woman who had existed her entire life beneath the oppressive dominance of her father, Jacob's simple benevolence was like water in a desert. In October 1953, Jacob requested permission to formally woo Martha. The community reacted with a blend of astonishment and morbid inquisitiveness. How could a respectable man like Jacob be attracted to a woman with Martha's background? But secrets in small communities rarely stay entered permanently. On a Sunday afternoon following church, Clementine Parker approached Jacob in the church parking area. "You understand who those girls of father is, don't you?" she inquired, her tone low yet laden with implication. Jacob, uncomfortable with the query, replied that he presumed the father was Martha's deceased husband. Clementine emitted a dry laugh. "Martha was never wedded, Jacob. Those girls, their father is the identical man who was Martha's father. Jeremiah Hollister confined his own daughter." "Well, you comprehend what I'm expressing. You're becoming entangled with a cursed family." The revelation struck Jacob like a physical impact. He drove aimlessly along the winding mountain thoroughfares for hours, attempting to process what he had just heard. When he eventually returned to town, night had already fallen. He drove to the Hollister dwelling. Martha was seated on the porch as though anticipating him. "You discovered it, didn't you?" she inquired, her tone calm, accepting. Jacob nodded, unable to articulate words. "I understand if you never wish to see me again," Martha continued. "But before you depart, I'd like you to listen to my account." And thus, beneath the starry canopy of the Appalachian Mountains, Martha Hollister related her narrative, how her father had commenced abusing her shortly after her mother's demise, how at 14 she had attempted to flee once, only to be located and dragged back to the dwelling, where Jeremiah restrained her with a chain to the bedpost for weeks as punishment, how over the years she had conceived multiple times, delivering children who bore the hereditary burden of that forbidden union. "I loved them. You understand," she expressed, silent tears streaming down her face. "Despite how they were conceived, despite the abnormalities, despite everything. They were my offspring. I simply wanted to safeguard them, provide them some opportunity in existence." Jacob listened silently, his spirit divided between horror at the account he was hearing and increasing compassion for the woman before him who had endured more than anyone ought to. "And Jeremiah," he finally questioned, "how did he perish?" Martha gazed at the starry expanse for an extended moment before responding. "The winter was severe," she eventually said. "He fell ill. Pneumonia, presumably. He declined to descend the mountain to consult the physician. One day, he simply failed to awaken." There existed something in the manner she expressed it, an almost imperceptible pause, that made Jacob wonder if he was receiving the complete truth. Yet who was he to judge this woman after all she had experienced? On the day he passed, Martha proceeded, "I sensed I could breathe for the first time in decades. It's terrible to express that about your own father, I realize. Yet it was as though a shadow had been removed, not merely from me, but from the girls as well." Jacob grasped Martha's hands in his, a simple gesture of compassion that caused her eyes to overflow with tears once more. "No one ought to endure what you experienced," he expressed. "No one." At that instant, Sarah materialized at the dwelling entrance, her azure eyes Jeremiah's eyes, wide in the darkness. "Mommy," she called, her voice small and hesitant. Martha turned toward her daughter. "It's fine, dear. Mr. Wheeler and I are merely conversing. Return to bed." Sarah hesitated, examining Jacob cautiously before complying and re-entering the dwelling. "She resembles him," Martha murmured softly. "Occasionally when I observe her, I perceive him gazing back at me, and my heart freezes momentarily. Yet then she smiles or expresses something kind, and I recollect that she is not him. She is herself despite everything." Have you ever pondered how many Marthas are concealed out there, enduring silently, imprisoned in patterns of mistreatment that transmit from generation to generation? Leave in the comments. Break the silence. To demonstrate that we are attentive to these accounts that require telling, the subsequent months introduced an almost typical routine to the Hollister dwelling. Jacob visited consistently, assisting with repairs on the property and bringing small presents for the girls. The transformation in Martha was remarkable. The woman who once evaded eye contact and flinched at the slightest noise now occasionally smiled. The relationship between Jacob and Martha became the primary topic of local gossip. "It's not natural," commented Abigail Simmons, one of the local matriarchs. "A respectable man like Jacob becoming involved with, well, we all understand what she is." "She didn't do anything," replied Elenina Davis. "She was a victim, not a wrongdoer, and those girls are blameless of any transgression of their parents." Meanwhile, in the mountain dwelling, Martha grappled with her own internal demons. At night, following the girls' slumber, nightmares frequently awakened her. Perspiring and trembling, the ghost of Jeremiah still intensely present in her consciousness. "Sometimes I believe I perceive him," she admitted to Jacob, standing in the corner of the chamber or at the woodland's edge. I realize it's not genuine, yet it appears so authentic. Jacob gently proposed that she might benefit from conversing with someone. Martha initially resisted the notion, dreading condemnation and exposure. Yet when the nightmares started affecting her daily welfare, she ultimately concurred. Dr. Richard Montgomery, a psychiatrist who visited the larger town once monthly, became an unforeseen ally. A progressive individual for his era, he had examined the consequences of extended trauma and comprehended that Martha's conduct was not the outcome of some ethical deficiency, but rather a natural response to years of mistreatment. With his support, Martha gradually started to process her trauma. It was a painful journey, filled with relapses and moments of hopelessness, yet also of small advancements and glimpses of optimism. Meanwhile, Sarah, now 7 years old, flourished in school. Her inherent intellect combined with a fierce resolve to learn compensated for the occasional difficulties she encountered due to her genetics. Ruth, though never capable of a completely autonomous existence, developed surprising abilities in stitching and handiwork. But as the girls matured, unavoidable questions emerged. Sarah, particularly, started to inquire about her father. "Why don't I possess a father like the other children?" she asked Martha one night. Martha froze, the glass of water in her hand trembling slightly. How to elucidate something so complex and disturbing to a child? "Your grandfather Jeremiah looked after us after your father departed," Martha ultimately articulated, selecting her words meticulously. It wasn't exactly untruthful, yet it omitted the darker reality. "And where did my father go?" Sarah persisted. He wasn't prepared to be a father," Martha replied, sensing the words inadequate as soon as they left her mouth. Sarah, with the perceptiveness of children, realized there existed more to the narrative than her mother was prepared to disclose. Yet, like numerous children in complicated family circumstances, she learned not to press certain matters. In 1956, 3 years following Jeremiah's demise, Jacob requested Martha to wed him. It was a simple proposal made during an outdoor meal in a sunny clearing near the dwelling. Martha, caught off guard, didn't respond immediately. "Are you certain?" she eventually questioned. "After everything you understand about me, about my history." Jacob grasped her hands in his. "I understand you, Martha. Not merely your history, but who you are currently. A survivor. A mother who would do anything for her daughters. A woman possessing more fortitude than anyone I've ever encountered." Martha gazed at him, tears in her eyes. "I don't know if I'll ever be as typical, if I'll ever be capable of being a spouse in the manner you merit. I'm not requesting you to be something you're not," Jacob replied gently. "I'm requesting to construct something collectively, at our own tempo, in our own manner." The wedding was a modest ceremony held in the dwelling itself, with only a handful of attendees. Life as Mrs. Wheeler introduced a novel sense of legitimacy for Martha within the community. For Sarah and Ruth, Jacob became the paternal figure they never possessed, patient, gentle, encouraging. Yet the past possesses a method of resurfacing when least anticipated. In 1959, when Sarah was 13 years old, the identical age Martha was when Jeremiah's mistreatment commenced, she discovered an aged diary concealed in a container in the dwelling's loft. It was her mother's diary, initiated shortly following the demise of her grandmother Sarah. The yellowed leaves contained the raw truth that had been carefully concealed from her. The authentic nature of her birth, the reality that her grandfather was also her father, the deaths of her elder siblings due to hereditary abnormalities caused by consanguinity, her mother's silent anguish for so many years. When Martha discovered Sarah seated on the bed, the diary open in her lap, and silent tears streaming down her face, she instantly understood what had occurred. A chill spread through her physique. followed by a wave of nausea so intense that she needed to lean against the entrance to prevent collapsing. "Is it accurate?" inquired Sarah, her voice small and fractured. "Grandpa Jeremiah was my father." Martha shut her eyes, as though she could obstruct the reality of the circumstance. Yet when she opened them again, her daughter remained there, anticipating an answer that would alter her existence permanently. "Yes," Martha ultimately articulated, the word emerging like a painful sigh. "Yes, it's accurate." The disclosure of the truth to Sarah jolted the foundations of the Wheeler Hollister household. The adolescent became reclusive and silent. She stopped attending school for several weeks, dreading that somehow her classmates could discern the imprint of her origin upon her countenance. "I'm an abnormality," she told Martha during a painful discussion. "Half of my genetic material originates from the identical source. Is that why Ruth is the way she is? Is that why my other siblings perished and I survived? What's incorrect with me that we haven't yet uncovered?" Martha, devastated by her daughter's anguish, yet determined not to conceal behind falsehoods any longer, elucidated everything: the hereditary risks of consanguinity, why some offspring are more impacted than others, and the reality that Sarah seemed to have escaped the worst physical consequences. "But that doesn't signify I'm fine," argued Sarah. "What if I bear children someday? Will they inherit this contamination?" It was Jacob who proposed they consult a specialist in genetics. Dr. Benjamin Rosen, a Jewish physician who worked at a university in Philadelphia, was recognized for his pioneering work in human genetics. After exchanging correspondence with him, the household made the lengthy voyage to Pennsylvania for a consultation. "You are not an abnormality, my dear," he expressed after performing several examinations. "You are a young woman who had the misfortune to be born in challenging circumstances, yet that doesn't define who you are or who you can become." He clarified to Sarah how genetics functions, how each individual carries potentially problematic recessive genes, yet these genes generally don't create difficulties unless they are combined with similar genes from another parent. If you wed someone with no genetic connection to your household, your offspring will probably be as healthy as any other child. He stated, "The crucial thing is that your future partner has no link to the Hollister lineage." The consultation with Dr. Rosen signified a turning point for Sarah. Although the truth about her origins remained painful, she started to separate that truth from her personal identity. She wasn't merely the offspring of incest. She was Sarah Wheeler, having officially adopted Jacob's surname. A young woman with her own aspirations and possibilities, life in the mountain dwelling gradually discovered a new equilibrium. Ruth, now 18 years old, persisted in developing her aptitude for crafts. Tata quilts and tapestries commenced gaining recognition beyond the local community. In 1962, Sarah at 16 encountered Michael Prescott, the son of a university professor who had relocated to the region to examine the culture and music of the Appalachian Mountains. Michael rapidly became her companion and ultimately her initial romantic attachment. When Sarah finally gathered the bravery to inform Michael about her family background, fearing his rejection, he astonished her with his reaction. "My father is Jewish," he expressed. "My grandparents escaped the pogroms in Russia. I understand what it's like to bear the weight of family history, Sarah. I understand what it's like to be judged not for who you are, but for what other individuals think you symbolize." The romance between Sarah and Michael blossomed when Sarah obtained a scholarship to study nursing at West Virginia University, an exceptional accomplishment for a young woman of her background. Michael supported her decision. Martha observed her daughter's advancement with a blend of pride and wonder. Sarah was charting a course that she herself never had the chance to contemplate: advanced education, a profession, the liberty to select her own partner and determine her own fate. In 1965, when Sarah was in her ultimate year of nursing education, she and Michael wed in a modest ceremony in the university chapel. Martha, dressed in a pale blue outfit, never appeared as luminous as at the moment when she witnessed her daughter walking down the aisle toward a future that she herself could never have envisioned. That identical year, Dr. Montgomery proposed that Martha contemplate sharing her story more extensively. The field of psychology was starting to acknowledge the prevalence and impact of child abuse and incest, topics that were previously nearly entirely forbidden. Your experience recounted anonymously could assist professionals in better understanding how to identify and aid victims. He elucidated, and perhaps more importantly, it could assist other women and girls in similar circumstances to realize that they are not solitary. Following months of careful deliberation and discussions with Jacob and her daughters, Martha consented to be interviewed for an academic study on survivors of prolonged family abuse. Her case, published under the pseudonym Patient H, became one of the most referenced in the emerging literature on trauma and resilience. In 1970, Ruth passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 29. Cardiac complications, probably connected to her genetics, led to silent heart failure. She departed, encircled by her creations, quilts, tapestries, and embroideries that recounted stories in fabric when she couldn't articulate them in words. Sarah, now a respected nurse and mother of 2 healthy offspring, Elizabeth and James, returned for the burial service with Michael and the children. It was the initial occasion that Elizabeth, 5 years old, and James, 3, visited the mountain dwelling where their mother had grown up. Martha, now 53 years old, observed her grandchildren playing in the identical clearing where she herself had played as a child, where Sarah had taken her initial steps, where Ruth had sat to sew in the sunlight. There existed a continuity there, yet also a profound and necessary rupture from the past. They'll never understand, will they? She inquired of Sarah, as they watched the children concerning Jeremiah, concerning everything. Sarah looked at her mother, the azure eyes, Jeremiah's eyes, now softened by wisdom and compassion. One day, when they're older, I'll relate to them a version of the narrative, she replied. Not all the particulars, yet enough for them to comprehend where we originated, what we surmounted. I desire them to understand about their grandmother's fortitude, how you terminated a pattern that could have persisted for generations. Martha experienced tears burning in her eyes. Do you believe it's possible, genuinely breaking the pattern after so many generations? Sarah smiled, a smile that conveyed as much understanding as hope. Observe them, Mom. Observe me and Michael. Observe you and Jacob. We've already terminated it. In that instant, as the sun descended behind the Appalachian mountains, bathing the clearing in a golden illumination, Martha Hollister Wheeler finally permitted herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the transgressions of the fathers need not be visited upon the offspring, that with affection, bravery, and truth, even the darkest narratives could yield to fresh commencements. The years passed, the mountains remained silent witnesses to generations of anguish and recovery. The Hollister dwelling, eventually deserted following the deaths of Martha and Jacob in 1985, slowly returned to the soil. The small family burial ground became a tranquil place, visited only occasionally by Sarah and subsequently by her offspring and grandchildren. The narrative of the Hollister Wheeler family now exists primarily in academic memory, in the archives of studies on family abuse and human resilience, and in the stories transmitted through generations of Sarah's family. What was once a pattern of abuse and trauma became a narrative of overcoming and hope. Check your subscription status for this channel. Ensure you don't overlook any impactful narratives like this one that exposes the concealed truths within American households. Subscribe immediately to continue exploring humanity's most shadowy mysteries. If you watched until this point, it's because you appreciated this narrative. Leave a comment stating, "I watched until here," so I can become acquainted with you and understand who genuinely appreciates the narratives on this channel. Don't forget to leave your approval and share this narrative with individuals you know would be affected by this revelation about the shadowy aspect of existence in the Appalachian Mountains.